India was one of the primary concerns of both the Cecil Bloc and Milner Group. The latter probably devoted more time and attention to India than to any other subject. This situation reached its peak in 1919, and the Government of India Act of that year is very largely a Milner Group measure in conception, formation, and execution. The influence of the two groups is not readily apparent from the lists of Governor General, Viceroys and Secretaries of State for India in the 20th century. Viceroys: Lord Curzon, 1898–1905, Lord Minto, 1905–1910, Lord Hardinge of Punchurst, 1910–1916, Lord Chelmsford, 1916–1921, Lord Reading, 1921–1926, Lord Irwin, 1926–1931, Lord Willingdon, 1931–1936, Lord Linlithgow, 1936–1943, Secretaries of State: Lord George Hamilton, 1895–1903, St. John Broderick, 1903–1908, John Morley, 1908–1910, Lord Crewe, 1910–1915, Austin Chamberlain, 1915–1917, Edward Montagu, 1917–1922, Lord Peel, 1922–1924, Lord Oliver, 1924, Lord Birkenhead, 1924–1928, Lord Peel, 1928–1929, Wedgwood Bent, 1929–1931, Sagnal Court, 1931–1935, Lord Zetland, 1935–1940, Leopold Amory, 1940–1945. Of the Viceroys, only one reading is clearly of neither the Cecil Bloc nor the Milner Group. Two were members of the Milner Group, Irwin and Willingdon. Another was a member of both groups, Chelmsford. The rest were of the Cecil Bloc, although in two cases Minto and Linlithgow in a rather peripheral fashion. 3 of the 8 were members of All Souls. According to Lord Esher, the appointment of Lord Hardinge in 1910 was made at his suggestion by John Morley. At the time, Esher's son, the present Viscount Esher, was acting as unpaid private secretary to Morley, a position he held for 5 years, 1905–1910. From the same source we learn that the viceroyship was offered to Selborne in 1903 and to Esher himself in 1908. The former failed of appointment because Curzon refused to retire, while the latter rejected the post as of too limited influence. Of the 13 Secretaries of State, 2 were Labour and 2 Liberals. One of these latter, Morley, was close to the Milner Group. Of the other 9, 3 were of the Cecil Bloc: St. John Broderick, Austin Chamberlain, and Lord Zetland. 2 were of the Milner Group, Hoare and Amory, and 4 were of neither group. The political and constitutional history of India in the 20th century consists largely of a series of investigations by various committees and commissions, and a second, and shorter, series of legislative enactments. The influence of the Milner Group can be discerned in both of these, especially in regard to the former. of the important commissions that investigated Indian constitutional questions in the 20th century. Every one has had a member of the inner circle of the Milner Group. The following list gives the name of the commission, the dates of its existence, the number of British members in distinction from Indian members, the names of representatives from the Cecil Block and Milner Group with the latter italicized, and the command number of its report. 1. The Royal Commission on Decentralisation in India, 1907 to 1909, 5 members including W. L. Kitchen CMD, 4360, of 1908. 2. The Royal Commission on Public Services in India, 1912 to 1915, 9 members including Baron Billington, the Earl of Ronald-G. later Marquis of Zelland, Sir Palatine Carroll, and H.A.L. Fisher. The chairman of this commission, Lord Billington, was later father-in-law to Sir Edward Gribbe, Lord Altrincham CMD, 83-82, of 1916. 3. The Government of India Constitutional Reform Committee on Franchise, 1919, 4 members, including Malcolm Haley. 4. The Government of India Constitutional Reform Committee on Functions, 1919, 4 members, including Richard Feetham as chairman. 5. The Joint Select Committee on the Government of India Bill, 1919, 14 members, including Lord Selborne chairman, Lord Middleton St John Broderick, Lord Billington, Sir Henry Craik, whose son was in Milner's kindergarten, and W. G. A. Ormsby Gord, now Lord Harlech CMD, 97, of 1919. 6. The Committee on Home Administration of Indian Affairs, 1919, 8 members, including W. G. A. Ormsby Gord, Lord Harlech CMD, 207, of 1919. 7. The Royal Commission on Superior Civil Services in India, 1923 to 1924, 5 members, including Lord Leofferum as chairman and Reginald Coupland CMD, 21-28, of 1924. 8. The Indian Statutory Commission, 1927 to 1930, 7 members, with Sir John Simon as chairman CMD, 3568 and 3569, of 1930. 9. The Indian Franchise Committee, 1931 to 1932, 8 members, including Lord Lothian as chairman and Lord Dufferin, whose brother, Lord Basil Blackwood, had been in Milner's kindergarten CMD, 4086, of 1932. 10. The 3 Indian Round Table Conferences of 1930 to 1932 contained a number of members of the Milner Group. The first session, November-January 1930-1931, had 89 delegates, 16 from Britain, 16 from the Indian States, and 57 from British India. Formed as they were by a Labour government, the first 2 sessions had 8 Labour members among the 16 from Britain. The other 8 were Earl Peel, the Marquis of Zelland, Sir Samuel Hoare, Oliver Stanley, the Marquis of Reading, the Marquis of Lothian, Sir Robert Hamilton, and Isaac Foote. Of these 8, 2 were of the Milner crew Hoare and Lothian and 2 of the Cecil Block Zelland and Stanley. The chief advisor to the Indian States delegation was L. F. Rushbrook Williams of the Milner Group, who was named to his position by the Chamber of Princes Special Organization. Among the 5 officials called in for consultation by the conference, we find the name of Malcolm Haley CMD. 3778. The membership of delegations at the second session September-December 1931 was practically the same, except that 31 additional members were added and Rushbrook Williams became a delegate as the representative of the Maharaja of Nawanagar CMD. 3997. At the third session November-December 1932 there were no Labour Party representatives. The British delegation was reduced to 12. 4 of these were of the Milner Group: Hoare, Simon, Lothian, and Irwin, now Halifax. Rushbrook Williams continued as a delegate of the Indian States CMD. 40-38. 1-1. The Joint Select Committee on Indian Constitutional Reform, appointed in April 1933, had 16 members from the House of Commons and an equal number of Lords. Among these were such members of the Milner Group as Sir Samuel Hoare, Sir John Simon, Lord Lothian, and Lord Irwin Halifax. The Cecil Block was also well represented by Archbishop Lang of Canterbury, Austin Chamberlain, Lord Eustace Percy, Lord Salisbury, Lord Zetland, Lord Lytton, and Lord Hardinge of Punchurst. 12. The Cripps Mission, 1942, for members, including Reginald Coupland, who wrote an unofficial but authoritative book on the mission as soon as it returned to England CMD. 6350. The chief legislative events in this period were 5 in number: the 2 Indian Councils Acts of 1892 and 1909, the 2 Government of India Acts of 1919 and 1935, and the achievement of self-government in 1947. The Indian Councils Act of 1892 was put through the House of Commons by George Curzon, at that time Under Secretary in the India Office as the protégé of Lord Salisbury, who had discovered him in All Souls 9 years earlier. This act was important for 2 reasons. 1. It introduced a representative principle into the Indian government by empowering the Governor-General and provincial governors to seek nominations to the unofficial seats in their councils from particular Indian groups and associations. And 2. It accepted a communal basis for this representation. By seeking these nominations separately from Hindus, Muslims, and others, from these 2 sources flowed ultimately self-government and partition, although it is perfectly evident that neither of these was anticipated or desired by the persons who supported the act. The nominations for unofficial members of the councils provided in the Act of 1892 became elections in practice, because the Governor-General always accepted the suggested nominations as his nominees. This practice became law in the Act of 1909. The Indian Councils Act of 1909 was passed under a Liberal government and was only remotely influenced by the Cecil Block or Milner Group. The Prime Minister, Asquith, was practically a member of the Cecil Block, being an intimate friend of Balfour and Rosebery. This relationship had been tightened when he married Margaret Tennant, a member of the Souls, in 1894. Margaret Tennant's sister, Laura, had previously married Alfred Lyttelton, and both sisters had been intimate friends of Curzon and other members of the Souls. Asquith had also been, as we have stated, a close associate of Milner's. Asquith, however, was never a member of the Milner Group. After 1890, and especially after 1915, he increasingly became a member of the Cecil Block. It was Balfour who persuaded Asquith to write his memories and reflections after Balfour had discussed the matter with Margaret Asquith over a tete-a-tete dinner. These dinners were a not infrequent occurrence on the evenings when Asquith himself dined at his club, Asquith usually stopping by later in the evening to get his wife and escort her home. Another indication of Asquith's feeling toward the Cecil Block can be found in his autobiography under the date December 22, 1919. On that occasion Asquith told Lady Hartington, daughter of Lord Salisbury, that he had not expected to live to see the day when the best safeguard for true liberalism would be found in an unreformed House of Lords and the Cecil family. In 1908 to 1909, however, the situation was somewhat different, and Asquith could hardly be called a member of the Cecil Block. In a somewhat similar situation, although much closer to the Milner Group through H.A.L. Fisher and All Souls, was John Morley, the Secretary of State for India. Lord Minto, the Governor-General in India, was also a member of the Cecil Block in a peripheral fashion but held his appointment through the family claim on the Governor-Generalship rather than by favour of the Cecils. The Act of 1909, however, while not the product of the groups with which we are concerned, was formed in the same social tradition, drawn up from the same intellectual and social outlook, and put into effect in the same fashion. It legalized the principle of election rather than nomination to Indian councils, enlarged their membership to provide majorities of non-officials in the provincial councils, and gave them the power to discuss affairs and pass resolutions. The seats were allotted to communal groups, with the minorities like Muslims and Sikhs receiving more than their proportionate share and the Muslims having, in addition, a separate electorate for the incumbents of Muslim seats. This served to encourage extremism among the Muslims and, while a logical development of 1892, was a long step on the road to Pakistan. This Act of 1909 was, as we have mentioned, put through the House of Commons by Sir Thomas Buchanan, a Fellow of All Souls and an associate of the Cecil Block. The Government of India Act of 1919 is outstanding in many ways. It is the most drastic and most important reform made in Indian government in the whole period from 1861 to the achievement of self-government. Its provisions for the central government of India remained in force, with only slight changes, from 1919 to 1946. It is the only one of these acts whose secret legislative background is no longer a secret, and it is the only one which indicated the desire on the part of the British government to establish in India the responsible government patterned on that in Britain. The legislative history of the Act of 1919, as generally known, is simple enough. It runs as follows. In August 1917, the Secretary of State for India, Edwin S. Montagu, issued a statement which read, "The policy of HM government, with which the Government of India are in complete accord, is that of the increasing association of Indians in every branch of the administration and the gradual development of self-government institutions with a view to the progressive realization of responsible government in India as an integral part of the British Empire." The critical word here is responsible government, since the prospect of eventual self-government had been held out to India for years. In accordance with this promise, Montagu visited India and, in cooperation with the Viceroy, Lord Chelmsford, issued a Montagu-Chelmsford report, indicating the direction of future policy. This report became the basis for the Bill of 1918, which, after a certain amount of amendment by Lord Selborne's Joint Select Committee, came into force as the Government of India Act of 1919. The secret history of this act is somewhat different, and begins in Canada in 1909, when Lionel Curtis accepted from his friend William Maris the idea that responsible government on the British pattern should be extended to India. 2 years later, Curtis formed a study group of 6 or 8 persons within the London Round Table Group. We do not know for certain who were the members of the study group, but apparently it included Curtis, Carroll, Fisher, and probably Brand. To these were added 3 officials of the India Office. These included Malcolm Seaton, Sir Malcolm after 1919, who was Secretary to the Judicial Department of the India Office and joined Curtis's group about 1913, and Sir William Duke, who was Lieutenant Governor of Bengal in 1911 to 1912, senior member of the Council of the Governor of Bengal in 1912 to 1914, and a member of the Council of India in London after 1914. At this last date he joined the Curtis Group. Both of these men were important figures in the India Office later on, Sir William as Permanent Under Secretary from 1920 to his death in 1924, and Sir Malcolm as Assistant Under Secretary 1919 to 1924 and Deputy Under Secretary 1924 to 1933. Sir Malcolm wrote the biographical sketch of Sir William in the Dictionary of National Biographies, and also wrote the volume on the India Office in the Whitehall series 1926. The third member from this same source was Sir Lionel Abrahams, Assistant Under Secretary in the India Office. The Curtis Study Group was not an official committee, although some persons both at the time and since have believed it was. Among these persons would appear to be Lord Chelmsford, for in debate in the House of Lords in November 1927 he said, I came home from India in January 1916 for 6 weeks before I went out again as Viceroy, and, when I got home, I found that there was a committee in existence at the India office, which was considering on what lines future constitutional development might take place. That committee, before my return in the middle of March, gave me a pamphlet containing in broad outline the views which were held with regard to future constitutional development. When I reached India, I showed this pamphlet to my council and also to my noble friend, Lord Meston, who was then Lieutenant Governor of the United Provinces. It contained what is now known as the Dr. Principle. Both the Council and Lord Meston, who was then Sir James Meston, reported adversely on the proposals for constitutional development contained in that pamphlet. Lord Chelmsford then goes on to say that Austin Chamberlain combated their objections with the argument that the Indians must acquire experience in self-government. So, after the announcement to this effect was made publicly in August 1917, the officials in India accepted Dr. If Lord Chelmsford believed that the pamphlet was an official document from a committee in the India office, he was in error. The other side of the story was revealed by Lionel Curtis in 1920 in his book Dr. According to Curtis, the study group was originally formed to help him write the chapters on India in the planned second volume of the Commonwealth of Nations. It set as its task to inquire how self-government could be introduced and peacefully extended to India. The group met once a fortnight in London and soon decided on the Dr. Principle. This principle, as any reader of Curtis's writings knows, was basic in Curtis's political thought and was the foundation on which he hoped to build a federated empire. According to Curtis, the study group asked itself, could not provincial electorates through legislatures and ministers of their own be made clearly responsible for certain functions of government to begin with, leaving all others in the hands of executives responsible as at present to the Government of India and the Secretary of State? Indian electorates, legislatures, and executives would thus be given the field for the exercise of genuine responsibility. From time to time fresh powers could be transferred from the old governments as the new elected authorities developed and proved their capacity for assuming them. From this point of view, Curtis asked Duke to draw up such a plan of devolution for Bengal. This plan was printed by the group, circulated, and criticized in typical Milner Group fashion. Then the whole group went to Oxford for 3 days and met to discuss it in the old bursary of Trinity College. It was then rewritten. No one was satisfied. It was decided to circulate it for further criticism among the Round Table groups throughout the world. But Lord Chelmsford wrote from New South Wales and asked for a copy. Apparently realizing that he was to be the next Viceroy of India, the group sent a copy to him and none to the Round Table groups, lest the public get hold of it and embarrass him. It is clear that Chelmsford was committed to a program of reform along these or similar lines before he went out as Viceroy. This was revealed in debate in the House of Lords by Lord Crewe on December 12, 1919. After Chelmsford went to India in March 1916, the new, revised version of the study group's plan was drawn up and sent to him in May 1916. Another copy was sent to Canada to catch up with Curtis, who had already left for India by way of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. This itinerary was undoubtedly followed by Curtis in order to consult with members of the group in various countries, especially with Brand in Canada. On his arrival in India, Curtis wrote back to Kerr in London, "The factor which impressed me most in Canada, New Zealand, and Australia was the rooted aversion these peoples have to any scheme which meant their sharing in the government of India. To these young democratic communities the principle of self-government is the breath of their nostrils. It is almost a religion. They feel as if there were something inherently wrong in one people ruling another. It is the same feeling as that which makes the Americans dislike governing the Philippines and decline to restore order in Mexico." My first impressions on this subject were strongly confirmed on my recent visit to these dominions. I scarcely recall one of the numerous meetings I addressed at which I was not asked why India was not given self-government and what steps were being taken in that direction. Apparently this experience strengthened Curtis's idea that India must be given responsible government. He probably felt that by giving India what it and the Dominions wanted for India, both would be bound in loyalty more closely to Britain. In this same letter to Kerr, Curtis said, in obvious reference to the Round Table Group, "Our task then is to bring home to the public in the United Kingdom and the Dominions how India differs from a country like Great Britain on the one hand and from Central Africa on the other, and how that difference is now reflected in the character of its government. We must outline clearly the problems which arise from the contact of East and West and the disaster which awaits the failure to supply their adequate solution by realizing and expressing the principle of government for which we stand. We must then go on to suggest a treatment of India in the general work of imperial reconstruction in harmony with the facts adduced in the foregoing chapters. And all this must be done with the closest attention to its effects upon educated opinion here. We must do our best to make Indian nationalists realize the truth that like South Africa all their hopes and aspirations are dependent on the maintenance of the British Commonwealth and their permanent membership therein." This letter, written on November 13, 1916, was addressed to Philip Kerr but was intended for all the members of the group. Sir Palatine Carroll corrected the draft, and copies were made available for Meston and Madras. Then Curtis had 1,000 copies printed and sent to Kerr for distribution. In some way, the extremist Indian nationalists obtained a copy of the letter and published a distorted version of it. They claimed that a powerful and secret group organized about the Round Table had sent Curtis to India to spy out the nationalist plans in order to obstruct them. Certain sentences from the letter were torn from their context to prove this argument. Among these was the reference to Central Africa, which was presented to the Indian people as a statement that they were as uncivilized and as incapable of self-government as Central Africans. As a result of the fears created by this rumor, the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League formed their one and only formal alliance in the shape of the famous Lucknow Compact of December 29, 1916. The Curtis letter was not the only factor behind the Lucknow Agreement, but it was certainly very influential. Curtis was present at the Congress meeting and was horrified at the version of his letter which was circulating. Accordingly, he published the correct version with an extensive commentary, under the title Letters to the People of India 1917. In this he said categorically that he believed, 1. That it is the duty of those who govern the whole British Commonwealth to do anything in their power to enable Indians to govern themselves as soon as possible. 2. That Indians must also come to share in the government of the British Commonwealth as a whole. There can be no doubt that Curtis was sincere in this and that his views reflected, perhaps in an extreme form, the views of a large and influential group in Great Britain. The failure of this group to persuade the Indian nationalists that they were sincere is one of the great disasters of the century, although the fault is not entirely theirs and must be shared by others, including Gandhi. In the first few months of 1917, Curtis consulted groups of Indians and individual British, chiefly of the Milner Group, regarding the form which the new constitution would take. The first public use of the word hierarchy was in an open letter of April 6, 1917, which he wrote to Bhupendranath Basu, one of the authors of the Lucknow Compact, to demonstrate how hierarchy would function in the United Provinces. In writing this letter, Curtis consulted with Valentine Carroll and Malcolm Quigley. He then wrote an outline, the structure of Indian government, which was revised by Meston and printed. This was submitted to many persons for comment. He then organized a meeting of Indians and British at Lord Sandhurst's house in Darjeeling and, after considerable discussion, drew up a 12-point program, which was signed by 64 Europeans and 9 the Indians. This was sent to Chelmsford and to Montague. In the meantime, in London, preparations were being made to issue the historic Declaration of August 28, 1917, which promised responsible government to India. There can be no doubt that the Milner Group was the chief factor in issuing that declaration. Curtis, in hierarchy, says, for the purpose of the private inquiry above described, the principle of that pronouncement was assumed in 1915. It is perfectly clear that Montagu's Secretary of State in succession to Austen Chamberlain from June 1917 did not draw up the declaration. He drew up a statement, but the India Office substituted for it one which had been drawn up much earlier, when Chamberlain was still Secretary of State. Lord Ronald G. E. Lord Zelland, in the third volume of his Life of Curzon, prints both drafts and claims that the one which was finally issued was drawn up by Curzon. Sir Stanley Reed, who was editor of the Times of India from 1907 to 1923, declared at a meeting of the Royal Institute of International Affairs in 1926 that the declaration was drawn up by Milner and Curzon. It is clear that someone other than Curzon had a hand in it, and the strongest probability would be Milner, who was with Curzon in the War Cabinet at the time. The fact is that Curzon could not have drawn it up alone unless he was unbelievably careless, because, after it was published, he was horrified when the promise of progressive realization of responsible government in India was pointed out to him. Montagu went to India in November 1917, taking Sir William Duke with him. Curtis, who had been moving about India as the guest of Stanley Reed, Carroll, Chelmsford, Meston, Madras, and others, was invited to participate in a Montagu-Chelmsford conferences on several occasions. Others who were frequently consulted were Daly, Meston, Duke, and Carroll. A Montagu-Chelmsford report was written by Sir William Madras of Milner's kindergarten after Curtis had returned to England. Curtis wrote in Diarchy in 1920, "It was afterwards suggested in the press that I had actually directed the report. My prompt denial has not prevented the further complaint from many quarters that Lord Chelmsford and Mr. Montagu were unduly influenced by an irresponsible tourist. With the exception of Lord Chelmsford himself, I was possibly the only person in India with first-hand knowledge of responsible government as applied in the Dominions to the institutions of provinces. Whether my knowledge of India entitled me to advance my views is more open to question. Of this the reader can judge for himself. But in any case the interviews were unsought by me." Thus Curtis does not deny the accusation that he was chiefly responsible for Diarchy. It was believed at the time by persons in a position to know that he was, and these persons were both for and against the plan. On the latter side, we might quote Lord Hampville, who, as a former acting viceroy, as private secretary to Joseph Chamberlain, as governor of Madras, and as brother-in-law of Sagnilkor, was in a position to know what was going on. Lord Hampville declared in the House of Lords in 1919, "The incredible fact is that, but for the chance visit to India of a globe-trotting doctrinaire, with a positive mania for constitution-mongering, nobody in the world would ever have thought of so peculiar a notion as Diarchy." And yet the Joint Committee tells us in an airy manner that no better plan can be conceived. The Joint Committee's favourable report on the Diarchy Bill was probably not unconnected with the fact that 5 out of 14 members were from the Cecil Block or Milner Group, that the chairman had in his day presided over meetings of the Round Table groups and was regarded by them as their second leader, and that the Joint Committee spent most of its time hearing witnesses who were close to the Milner Group. The committee heard Lord Meston longer than any other witness, almost 4 days, spent a day with Curtis on the stand, and questioned, among others, Feetham, Duke, Thomas Holland Fellow of All Souls from 1875 to his death in 1926, Michael Sadler, a close friend of Milner's and practically a member of the group, and Stanley Reed. In the House of Commons, the burden of debate on the bill was supported by Montagu, Sir Henry Craik, H.A.L. Fisher, W.G.A. Ormsby Gort, and Thomas J. Bennett, an old journalist colleague of Lord Salisbury and principal owner of the Times of India from 1892. Montagu and Craik both referred to Lionel Curtis. The former said, "It is suggested in some quarters that this bill arose spontaneously in the minds of the Viceroy and myself without previous inquiry or consideration, under the influence of Mr. Lionel Curtis. I have never yet been able to understand that you approach the merits of any discussion by vain efforts to approximate to its authorship. I do not even now understand that India or the Empire owes anything more or less than a great debt of gratitude to the patriotic and devoted services Mr. Curtis has given to the consideration of this problem." Sir Henry Craik later said, "I am glad to join in the compliment paid to our mutual friend, Mr. Lionel Curtis, who belongs to a very active and a very important body of young men, whom I should be the last to criticize. I am proud to know him, and to pay that respect to him due from age to youth. He and others of the company of the Round Table have been doing good work, and part of that good work has been done in India." Mr. Fisher had nothing to say about Lionel Curtis but had considerable to say about the bill and a Montagu-Chelmsford report. He said, "There is nothing in this bill which is not contained in that report. That report is not only a very able and eloquent state paper, but it is also one of the greatest state papers which have been produced in Anglo-Indian history, and it is an open-minded candid state paper, a state paper which does not ignore or gloss over the points of criticism which have since been elaborated in the voluminous documents which have been submitted to us." He added, a moment later, "This is a great bill." To the Round Table, which also approved of the bill, as might be imagined, referred to Fisher's speech in its issue of September 1919 and called him so high an authority. The editor of that issue was Lionel Curtis. In the House of Lords there was less enthusiasm. Chief criticism centered on two basic points, both of which originated with Curtis. One, the principle of hierarchy, that is, that government could be separated into two classes of activities under different regimes, and two, the effort to give India responsible government rather than merely self-government, that is, the effort to extend to India a form of government patterned on Britain's. Both of these principles were criticized vigorously, especially by members of the Cecil bloc, including Lord Middleton, Lord Lansdowne, Lord Selborne, Lord Salisbury, and others. Support for the bill came chiefly from Lord Curzon, leader in the Upper House, and Lord Billington, Under Secretary in the India Office. As a result of this extensive criticism, the bill was revised considerably in the Joint Committee but emerged with its main outlines unchanged and became law in December 1919. These main outlines, especially the two principles of hierarchy and responsibility, were, as we have said, highly charged with Curtis's own connotations. These became fainter as time passed, both because of developments in India and because Curtis from 1919 on became increasingly remote from Indian affairs. The refusal of the Indian National Congress under Gandhi's leadership to cooperate in carrying on the government under the Act of 1919 persuaded the other members of the group and perhaps Curtis himself that it was not possible to apply responsible government on the British model to India. This point of view, which had been stated so emphatically by members of the Cecil bloc even before 1900, and which formed the chief argument against the Act of 1919 in the debates in the House of Lords, was accepted by the Milner Group as their own after 1919. Halifax, Grigg, Amory, Coupland, Fisher, and others stated this most emphatically from the early 1920s to the middle 1940s. In 1943 Grigg stated this as a principle in his book The British Commonwealth and quoted with approval Amory's statement of March 30, 1943 to the House of Commons, rejecting the British parliamentary system as suitable for India. Amory, at that time Secretary of State for India, had said, like wasps buzzing angrily up and down against a window pane when an adjoining window may be wide open, we are all held up, frustrated and irritated by the unrealized and unsuperable barrier of our constitutional prepossessions. Grigg went even further, indeed, so far that we might suspect that he was deprecating the use of parliamentary government in general rather than merely in India. He said, "It is entirely devoid of flexibility and quite incapable of engendering the essential spirit of compromise in countries where racial and communal divisions present the principal political difficulty. The idea that freedom to be genuine must be accommodated to this pattern is deeply rooted in us, and we must not allow our statesmanship to be imprisoned behind the bars of our own experience. Our insistence in particular on the principle of a common roll of electors voting as one homogeneous electorate has caused reaction in South Africa, rebellion or something much too like it in Kenya, and deadlock in India, because in the different conditions of those countries it must involve the complete and perpetual dominance of a single race or creed. Unfortunately, as Reginald Coupland has pointed out in his book, India, the Statement 1945, all agreed that the British system of government was unsuited to India, but none made any effort to find an indigenous system that would be suitable. The result was that the Milner Group and their associates relaxed in their efforts to prepare Indians to live under a parliamentary system and finally cut India loose without an indigenous system and only partially prepared to manage a parliamentary system. This decline in enthusiasm for a parliamentary system in India was well underway by 1921. In the two-year interval from 1919 to 1921, the group continued as the most important British factor in Indian affairs. Curtis was editor of the Round Table in this period and continued to agitate the cause of the Act of 1919. Lord Chelmsford remained the Viceroy in this period. Meston and Daly were raised to the Viceroy's Executive Council. Sir William Duke became permanent Under-Secretary, and Sir Malcolm Seaton became Assistant Under-Secretary in the India Office. Sir William Maris was made Home Secretary of the Government of India and Special Reforms Commissioner in charge of setting up the new system. L.F. Rushbrook-Williams was given special duty at the Home Department, Government of India, in connection with the reforms. Thus the Milner Group was well placed to put the new law into effect. The effort was largely frustrated by Gandhi's boycott of the elections under the new system. By 1921 the Milner Group had left Indian affairs and shifted its chief interest to other fields. Curtis became one of the chief factors in Irish affairs in 1921. Lord Chelmsford returned home and was raised to a viscounty in the same year. Meston retired in 1919. Maris became Governor of Assam in 1921. Haley became Governor of the Punjab in 1924. Duke died in 1924. And Rushbrook-Williams became Director of the Central Bureau of Information, Government of India, in 1920. This does not indicate that the Milner Group abandoned all interest in India by 1924 or earlier, but the group never showed such concentrated interest in the problem of India again. Indeed, the group never displayed such concentrated interest in any problem either earlier or later, with the single exception of the effort to form the Union of South Africa in 1908 to 1909. The decade 1919 to 1929 was chiefly occupied with efforts to get Gandhi to permit the Indian National Congress to cooperate in the affairs of government, so that its members and other Indians could acquire the necessary experience to allow the progressive realization of self-government. The Congress Party, as we have said, boycotted the elections of 1920 and cooperated in those of 1924 only for the purpose of wrecking them. Nonetheless, the system worked, with the support of moderate groups, and the British extended one right after another in steady succession. Fiscal autonomy was granted to India in 1921, and that country at once adopted a protective tariff, to the considerable injury of British textile manufacturing. The superior civil services were opened to Indians in 1924. Indians were admitted to Woolwich and Sandhurst in the same year, and commissions in the Indian Army were made available to them. The appointment of Baron Irwin of the Milner Group to be Viceroy in 1926, an appointment in which, according to A. C. Johnson's biography Viscount Halifax 1941, the influence of Geoffrey Dawson and other members of the Times editorial staff may have played the decisive role, was the chief step in the effort to achieve some real progress under the Act of 1919. Before that Act came under the critical examination of another Royal Commission, scheduled for 1929. The new Viceroy Statement of Policy, made in India, July 17, 1926, was, according to the same source, embraced by the Times in an editorial which showed in no uncertain terms that Irwin's policy was appreciated and underwritten by Printing House Square. Unfortunately, In the period 1924 to 1931, the India Office was not in control of either the Milner Group or Cecil Block. For various reasons, of which this would seem to be the most important, coordination between the Secretary of State and the Viceroy and between Britain and the Indian nationalists broke down at the most crucial moments. The Milner Group, chiefly through the Times, participated in this situation in the period 1926 to 1929 by praising their man, Lord Irwin, and adversely criticizing the Secretary of State, Lord Birkenhead. Relationships between Birkenhead and the Milner and Cecil Group had not been cordial for a long time, and there are various indications of feuding from at least 1925. We may recall that in April 1925 a secret, or at least unofficial, committee of Milner Group and Cecil Block members had nominated Lord Milner for the post of Chancellor of Oxford University. Lord Birkenhead had objected both to the candidate and to the procedure. In regard to the candidate, he would have preferred Asquith. In regard to the procedure, he demanded to know by what authority this committee took upon itself the task of naming the Chancellor to a university of which he, Lord Birkenhead, had been High Steward since 1922. This protest, as usual when Englishmen of this social level are deeply moved, took the form of a letter to the Times. It received a tart answer in a letter, written in the third person, in which he was informed that this committee had existed before the World War, and that, when it was reconstituted at the end of the war, Mr. F. E. Smith had been invited to be a member of it but had not seen fit even to acknowledge the invitation. The bad relationship between the Milner Group and Lord Birkenhead was not the result of such episodes as this, but rather, it would seem, based on a personal antipathy engendered by the character of Lord Birkenhead and especially by his indiscreet and undiplomatic social life and political activity. Nonetheless, Lord Birkenhead was a man of unquestioned vigour and ability and a man of considerable political influence from the day in 1906 when he had won a parliamentary seat for the Conservatives in the face of a great Liberal tidal wave. As a result, he had obtained the post of Secretary of State for India in November 1924 at the same time that Leopold Amory went to the Colonial Office. The episode regarding the Milner candidacy to the Oxford Chancellorship occurred 6 months later and was practically a direct challenge from Birkenhead to Amory, since at that time the latter was Milner's active political lieutenant and one of the chief movers in the effort to make him Chancellor. Thus, in the period 1926 to 1929, the Milner Group held the Viceroy's post but did not hold the post of Secretary of State. The relationship between these two posts was such that good government could not be obtained without close cooperation between them. Such cooperation did not exist in this period. As far as the constitutional development was concerned, this lack of cooperation appeared in a tendency on the part of the Secretary of State to continue to seek a solution of the problem along the road marked by the use of the unilateral British Investigatory Commission, and a tendency on a part of Irwin and the Milner Group, to seek a solution along the newer road of cooperative discussion with the Indians. These tendencies did not appear as divergent routes until after the Simon Commission had begun its labors, with the result that accumulating evidence that the latter road would be used left that unilateral commission in an unenviable position. The Government of India Act of 1919 had provided that an investigation should be made of the functioning of the Act after it had been in effect for 10 years. The growing unrest of the Indians and their failure to utilize the opportunities of the Act of 1919 persuaded many Englishmen, including most of the Milner Group, that the promised statutory commission should begin its work earlier than anticipated and should direct its efforts rather at finding the basis for a new constitutional system than at examining the obvious failure of the system provided in 1919. The first official hint that the date of the statutory commission would be moved up was given by Birkenhead on March 30, 1927, in combination with some rather arrogant and patronizing remarks about Indian politics. The Times, while criticizing Birkenhead for his additional remarks, took up the suggestion regarding the commission and suggested in its turn that the ideal body would consist of judicially minded men who were able to agree. This is, of course, exactly what was obtained. The authorized biography by Count Halifax, whence these quotations have been taken, adds at this point, it is interesting to speculate how far Geoffrey Dawson, the editor, was again expressing Irwin's thoughts and whether a deliberate balloon essay was being put up in favour of Sir John Simon. The Simon Commission was exactly what the Times had wanted, a body of judicially minded men who were able to agree. Its chairman was the most expensive lawyer in England, a member of the Cecil bloc since he was elected to All Souls in 1897, and in addition a member of the two extraordinary clubs already mentioned, Grillins and the Club. Although he was technically a Liberal, his associations and inclinations were rather on the conservative side, and it was no surprise in 1931 when he became the National Liberal and occupied one of the most important seats in the cabinet, the Foreign Office. From this time on, he was closely associated with the policies of the Milner Group and, in view of his personal association with the leaders of the group in All Souls, may well be regarded as a member of the group. As chairman of the Statutory Commission, he used his legal talents to the full to draw up a report on which all members of the Commission could agree, and it is no small example of his abilities that he was able to get a unanimous agreement on a program which, in outline, if not in all its details, was just what the Milner Group wanted. Of the 6 other members of the Commission, 2 were Labourite Clement Attlee and Vernon Hartshorn. The others were Unionist or Conservative. Viscount Burnham of Eton and Balliol 1884 had been a Unionist supporter of the Cecil bloc in Commons from 1885 to 1906, and his father had been made baronet and baron by Lord Salisbury. His own title of Viscount came from Lloyd George in 1919. The 5th member of the Commission, Donald Palmer Howard, Baron Strathcona and Mount Royal, of Eton and Trinity College, Cambridge, had no special claim to fame except that he had been a Unionist MP in 1922 to 1926. The sixth member, Edward Cecil Cadogan of Eton and Balliol 1904, was the sixth son of Earl Cadogan and thus the older brother of Sir Alexander Cadogan, British delegate to the United Nations. Their father, Earl Cadogan, grandnephew of the first Duke of Wellington, had been Lord Privy Seal in Lord Salisbury's second government and Lord Lieutenant of Ireland in Salisbury's third government. Edward, who was knighted in 1939, had no special claim to fame except that he was a Unionist MP from 1922 to 1935 and was chairman of the House of Commons under the national government of 1931 to 1935. The seventh member, George R. Lane Fox Barrett Dingley, since 1933 of Eton and New College, was a Unionist MP from 1906 to 1931 and Secretary of Mines from 1922 to 1928. He is a brother-in-law and lifelong friend of Lord Halifax, having married the Honourable Mary Wood in 1903. The most extraordinary fact about the Simon Commission was the lack of qualification possessed by its members. Except for the undoubted advantages of education at Eton and Oxford, the members had no obvious claims to membership on any committee considering Indian affairs. Indeed, not one of the 8 members had had any previous contact with this subject. Nevertheless, the Commission produced an enormous 2-volume report which stands as a monumental source book for the study of Indian problems in this period. When, to the lack of qualifications of its members, we add the fact that the Commission was almost completely boycotted by Indians and obtained its chief contact with the natives by listening to their monotonous chants of Simon, Go back, it seems more than a miracle that such a valuable report could have emerged from their investigations. The explanation is to be found in the fact that they received full cooperation from the staff of the Government of India, including members of the Milner Group. It is clear that by the end of 1928 the Milner Group, as a result of the strong Indian opposition to the Simon Commission, the internal struggle within that commission between Simon and Burnham because of the latter's refusal to go as far as the former desired in the direction of concessions to the Indians and their inability to obtain cooperation from the Secretary of State as revealed in the steady criticism of Birkenhead in the Times, had decided to abandon the Commission method of procedure in favor of a round-table method of procedure. It is not surprising that the round-table groups should prefer a round-table method of procedure even in regard to Indian affairs, where many of the participants would have relatively little experience in the typical British procedure of agreement through conference. To the Milner Group, the round-table method was not only preferable in itself but was made absolutely necessary by the widespread Indian criticism of the Simon Commission for its exclusively British personnel. This restriction had been adopted originally on the grounds that only the purely British and purely parliamentary commission could commit Parliament in some degree to acceptance of the recommendations of the Commission, at least, This was the defense of the restricted membership made to the Indians by the Viceroy. On November 8, 1927, in place of this argument, the Milner Group now advanced a somewhat more typical idea, namely, that only Indian participation on a direct and equal basis could commit Indians to any plans for the future of India. By customary Milner Group reasoning, they decided that the responsibility placed on Indians by making them participate in the formulation of plans would moderate the extremism of their demands and bind them to participate in the execution of these plans after they were enacted into law. This basic idea, that if you have faith in people, they will prove worthy of that faith, or, expressed in somewhat more concrete terms, that if you give dissatisfied people voluntarily more than they expect and, above all, before they really expect to get it, they will not abuse the gift but will be sobered simultaneously by the weight of responsibility and the sweetness of gratitude, was an underlying assumption of the Milner Group's activities from 1901 to the present. Its validity was defended when proof was demanded by a historical example, that is, by contrasting the lack of generosity in Britain's treatment of the American colonies in 1774 with the generosity in her treatment of the Canadian colonies in 1839. The contrast between the intolerable acts and the Durham Report was one of the basic ideas at the back of the minds of all the important members of the Milner Group. In many of those minds, however, this assumption was not based on political history at all but had a more profound and largely unconscious basis in the teachings of Christ and the Sermon on the Mount. This was especially true of Lionel Curtis, John Duff, Lord Lothian, and Lord Halifax. Unless this idea is recognized, it is not possible to see the underlying unity behind the actions of the group toward the Boers in 1901 to 1910, toward India in 1919 and 1935, and toward Hitler in 1934 to 1939. These ideas as a justification of concessions to India are to be found in Milner Group discussions of the Indian problem at all periods, especially just before the Act of 1919. A decade later they were still exerting their influence. They will be found, for example, in the Round Table articles on India in September 1930 and March 1931. The earlier advocated the use of the Round Table method but warned that it must be based on complete equality for the Indian members. It continued, Indians should share equally with Great Britain the responsibility for reaching or failing to reach an agreement as to what the next step in Indian constitutional development should be. It is no longer a question, as we see it, of Great Britain listening to Indian representatives and then deciding for herself what the next Indian constitution should be. The core of the Round Table idea is that representative Britons and representative Indians should endeavour to reach an agreement, on the understanding that if they can reach an agreement, each will loyally carry it through to completion, as was the case with Ireland in 1922, is seen by the Milner Group. Britain's responsibility was her obligation to help Indians to take maximum responsibility for India's government on their own shoulders, and to insist on their doing so, not only because it is the right thing in itself, but because it is the most certain antidote to the real danger of anarchy which threatens India. Unless Indians do learn to carry responsibility for government at a very early date, there is less risk in going too fast in agreement and cooperation with political India than in going at a more moderate pace without its agreement and cooperation. Indeed, in our view, the most successful foundation for the Round Table Conference would be that Great Britain should ask the Indian delegates to table agreed proposals and then do her utmost to accept them and place on Indian shoulders the responsibility for carrying them into effect. It is very doubtful if the Milner Group could have substituted the Round Table method for the Commission method in quite so abrupt a fashion as it did, had not a Labour government come to office early in 1929. As a result, the difficult Lord Birkenhead was replaced as Secretary of State by the much more cooperative Mr. Wedgwood Bent Viscount Stansgate since 1941. The greater degree of cooperation which the Milner Group received from Bent than from Birkenhead may be explained by the fact that their hopes for India were not far distant from those held in certain circles of the Labour Party. It may also be explained by the fact that Wedgwood Bent was considerably closer, in a social sense, to the Milner Group than was Birkenhead. Bent had been the Liberal MP from 1906 to 1927. His brother Sir Ernest Bent, the publisher, had been close to the Milner Group in the Ministry of Munitions in 1916 to 1917 and in the Ministry of Reconstruction in 1917 to 1918, and his nephew John, oldest son of Sir Ernest, married the oldest daughter of Maurice Hankey in 1929. Whatever the cause, or combination of causes, Lord Irwin's suggestion that the Round Table method be adopted was accepted by the Labour government. The suggestion was made when the Viceroy returned to London in June 1929, months before the Simon Report was drafted and a year before it was published. Was this suggestion Lord Irwin combined another, that the government formally announced that its goal for India was Dominion status. The plan leaked out, probably because the Labour government had to consult with the Liberal Party, on which its majority depended. The Liberals Lord Reading and Lloyd George advised against the announcement, but Irwin was instructed to make it on his return to India in October. Lord Birkenhead heard of the plan and wrote a vigorous letter of protest to the Times. When Geoffrey Dawson refused to publish it, it appeared in the Daily Telegraph, thus repeating the experience of Lord Lansdowne's even more famous letter of 1917. Lord Irwin's announcement of the Round Table Conference and of the goal of Dominion status, made in India on October 31, 1929, brought a storm of protest in England. It was rejected by Lord Reading and Lloyd George for the Liberals and by Lord Birkenhead and Stanley Baldwin for the Conservatives. It is highly unlikely that the Milner Group were much disturbed by this storm. The reason is that the members of the crew had already decided that Dominion status had two meanings: one meaning for Englishmen, and a second, rather different, meaning for Indians. As Lord Irwin wrote in a private memorandum in November 1929, to the English conception, Dominion status now connotes, as indeed the word itself implies, an achieved constitutional position of complete freedom and immunity from interference by His Majesty's government in London. The Indian seems generally to mean something different. The underlying element in much of Indian political thought seems to have been the desire that, by free conference between Great Britain and India, a constitution should be fashioned which may contain within itself the seed of full dominion status, growing naturally to its full development in accordance with the particular circumstances of India, without the necessity, the implications of which the Indian mind presents, of further periodic inquiries by way of commission. What is to the Englishman an accomplished process is to the Indian rather a declaration of right, from which future and complete enjoyment of dominion privilege will spring. 3. This distinction, without any reference to Lord Irwin, whose memorandum was not published until 1941, was also made in the September 1930 issue of the Round Table. On this basis, for the sake of appeasement of India, the Milner Group was willing to promise India dominion status in the Indian meaning of the expression and allow the English who misunderstood to cool off gradually as they saw that the development was not the one they had feared. Indeed, to the Milner Group, it probably appeared that the greater the rage in Britain, the greater the appeasement in India. Accordingly, the first session of the Round Table Conference was called for November 1930. It marked an innovation not only because of the status of equality and responsibility which it placed on the Indians, but also because, for the first time, it tried to settle the problem of the Indian states within the same framework as it settled the constitutional problem of British India. This was a revolutionary effort, and its degree of success was very largely due to the preparatory work of Lord Irwin, acting on the advice of Malcolm Haley. The Indian states had remained as backward, feudalistic, and absolutist enclaves within the territorial extent of British India and bound to the British Raj by individual treaties and agreements. As might be expected from the Milner Group, the solution which they proposed was federation. They hoped that devolution in British India would secure a degree of provincial autonomy that would make it possible to bind the provinces and the Indian states within the same federal structure and with similar local autonomy. However, the group knew that the Indian states could not easily be federated with British India until their systems of government were raised to some approximation of the same level. For this reason, and to win the princes over to federation, Lord Irwin had a large number of personal consultations with the princes in 1927 and 1928. That some of these he lectured the princes on the principles of good government in a fashion which came straight from the basic ideology of the Milner Group. The memorandum which he presented to them, dated June 14, 1927 and published in Johnson's biography, Viscount Halifax, could have been written by the kindergarten This can be seen in its definitions of the function of government, its emphasis on the reign of law, its advocacy of devolution, its homily on the duty of princes, its separation of responsibility in government from democracy in government, and its treatment of democracy as an accidental rather than an essential characteristic of good government. The value of this preparatory work appeared at the first Round Table Conference, where, contrary to all expectations, the Indian princes accepted federation. The optimism resulting from this agreement was, to a considerable degree, dissipated, however, by the refusal of Gandhi's party to participate in the conference unless India were granted full and immediate dominion status. Refusal of these terms resulted in an outburst of political activity which made it necessary for Irwin to find jails capable of holding 60,000 Indian agitators at one time. The view that the Round Table Conference represented a complete repudiation of the Simon Commission's approach to the Indian problem was assiduously propagated by the Milner Group in order to prevent Indian animosity against the latter from being carried over against the former. But the differences were in detail, since in main outline both reflected the group's faith in federation, devolution, responsibility, and minority rights. The chief recommendations of the Simon Commission were three in number: 1. To create a federation of British India and the Indian states by using the provinces of the former as federative units with the latter. 2. To modify the central government by making the Legislative Assembly a federal organization, but otherwise leave the centre unchanged. 3. To end anarchy in the provinces by making Indians responsible for all provincial activities. It also advocated separation of Burma from India. These were also the chief conclusions of the various Round Table Conferences and of the government's White Papers of December 1931 CMD 3972 and of March 1933 CMD 4268. The former was presented to Parliament and resulted in a debate and vote of confidence on the government's policy in India as stated in it. The attack was led by Winston Churchill in the Commons and by Lords Lloyd, Salisbury, Middleton, and Sumner in the House of Lords. None of these except Churchill openly attacked the government's policy, the others contenting themselves with advising delay in its execution. The government was defended by Samuel Hoare, John Simon, and Stanley Baldwin in the Commons and by Lords Lothian, Irwin, Zetland, Dufferin, and Hailsham, as well as Archbishop Lang, in the Lords. Lord Lothian, in opening the debate, said that while visiting in India in 1912 he had written an article for an English review saying that the Indian nationalist movement was essentially healthy, for it was a movement for political virtue and self-respect, although the Indian civil servant with whom he was staying said that Indian nationalism was sedition. Lord Lothian implied that he had not changed his opinion 20 years later. In the lower house the question came to a vote, which the government easily carried by 369 to 43. In the majority were Leopold Amory, John J. Astor, John Buchan, Austin Chamberlain, Viscount Cranbourne, Samuel Hoare, W.G.A. Ormsby Gort, Lord Eustace Percy, John Simon, and D.B. Somerville. In the minority were Churchill, George Balfour, and Viscount Walmer. Practically the same persons appeared on the same sides in the discussion regarding the White Paper of 1933. This document, which embodied the government's suggestions for a bill on Indian constitutional reform, was defended by various members of the Milner Group outside of Parliament, and anonymously in the Round Table. John Buchan wrote a preface to John Thomson's India, the White Paper 1933, in which he defended the extension of responsible government to India, saying, "We cannot exclude her from sharing in what we ourselves regard as the best." Samuel Hoare defended it in a letter to his constituents at Chelsea. Malcolm Haley defended it before the Royal Empire Society Summer School at Oxford, in a speech afterwards published in the Asiatic Review. Haley had resigned as Governor of the United Provinces in India in order to return to England to help the government put through its bill. During the long period required to accomplish this, Samuel Hoare, who as Secretary of State for India was the official government spokesman on the subject, had Haley constantly with him as his chief advisor and support. It was this support that permitted Hoare, whose knowledge of India was definitely limited, to conduct his astounding campaign for the Act of 1935. The White Paper of 1933 was presented to a joint select committee of both houses. It was publicly stated as a natural action on the part of the government that this committee be packed with supporters of the bill. For this reason Churchill, George Balfour, and Lord Walmer refused to serve on it, although Josiah Wedgwood, a Labour member who opposed the bill, asked to be put on the committee because it was packed. The Joint Select Committee, as we have seen, had 32 members, of whom at least 12 were from the Cecil Block and Milner Group and supported the bill. 4 were from the inner circles of the Milner Group. The chief witnesses were Sir Samuel Hoare, who gave testimony for 20 days, Sir Michael O'Dwyer, who gave testimony for 4 days, and Winston Churchill, who gave testimony for 3 days. The chief witness was thus Hoare, who answered 55-94 questions from the committee. At all times Hoare had Malcolm Haley at his side for advice. The fashion in which the government conducted the Joint Select Committee aroused a good deal of unfavourable comment. Lord Rankeillor in the House of Lords criticised this, especially the fashion in which Hoare used his position to push his point of view and to influence the evidence which the committee received from other witnesses. He concluded, "This committee was not the judicial body, and its conclusions are vitiated thereby. You may say that on their merits they have produced a good or a bad report, but what you cannot say is that the report is the judicial findings of unbiased or impartial minds." As a result of such complaints, the House of Commons Committee on Privilege investigated the conduct of the Joint Select Committee. It found that horse actions toward witnesses and in regard to documentary evidence could be brought within the scope of the standing orders of the House if a distinction were made between judicial committees and non-judicial committees and between witnesses giving facts and giving opinions. These distinctions made it possible to acquit Sir Samuel of any violation of privilege, but aroused such criticism that a select committee on witnesses was formed to examine the rules for dealing with witnesses. In its report, on June 4, 1935, this select committee rejected the validity of the distinctions between judicial and non-judicial and between fact and opinion made by the Committee on Privilege, and recommended that the standing rules be amended to forbid any tampering with documents that had been received by a committee. The final result was a formal acquittal, but a moral condemnation, of horse actions in regard to the Joint Select Committee on the Government of India. The report of the Joint Select Committee was accepted by 19 out of its 32 members. 9 voted against it, 5 Conservative and 4 Labour members. A motion to accept the report and ask the government to proceed to draw up a bill based on it was introduced in the House of Lords by the President of the Board of Education, Lord Halifax Lord Irwin, on December 12, 1934, in a typical Milner Group speech. He said, as I read it, the whole of our British and imperial experience shouts at us the warning that representative government without responsibility, once political consciousness has been aroused, is apt to be a source of great weakness and, not impossibly, great danger. We had not learned that lesson, let me remind the House, in the 18th century. And we paid very dearly for it. We learned it some 60 years later, and, by having learned it, we transformed the face and history of Canada. Lord Salisbury once again advised delay, and attacked the idea that parliamentary government could work in India or indeed had worked anywhere outside the British Commonwealth. Lord Snell, speaking for the Labour opposition, objected to the lack of protection against economic exploitation for the Indian masses, the omission of any promise of dominion status for India, the weighting of the franchise too heavily on the side of the landlords and too lightly on the side of women or of labourers, the provisions for a second chamber, and the use of indirect election for the first chamber. Lord Lothian answered both speakers, supporting only one criticism, that against indirect election to the Central Assembly. He made the significant statement that he did not fear to turn India over to the Congress Party of Gandhi because I disagree with almost everything that they say in public and most of their political program. I have a sneaking sympathy with the emotion which lies underneath them. The aspiration of young impetuous India anxious to take responsibility on its own shoulders and to because I believe that the one political lesson, which has more often been realized in the British Commonwealth of Nations than anywhere else in the world, is that the one corrective of political extremism is to put responsibility upon the extremists. And, by these proposals, that is exactly what we are doing. These are typical Milner Group reasons. In the debate, Halifax was supported by Archbishop Lang and Lords Zetland, Linlithgow, Mid Lytton, Hardinge of Punchurst, Lytton, and Reading. Lord Salisbury was supported by Lords Figley-Moore, Rank-Killiord, Hamphill, and Lloyd. In the division, Salisbury's motion for delay was beaten by 239 to 62. In addition to the Lords mentioned, the majority included Lords Dufferin, Linlithgow, Cranbrook, Codenham, Cecil of Shelwood, Goshen, Hampden, Elton, Lugard, Meston, and Vedmus, while the minority included Lords Birkenhead, Westminster, Tarnock, Islington, and Beaconsfield. It is clear that the Milner group voted completely with the majority, while the Cecil bloc was split. The bill was introduced in the House of Commons on February 6, 1935 by Sir Samuel Hoare. As was to be expected, his argument was based on the lessons to be derived from the error of 1774 and the success of 1839 in North America. The government's actions, he declared, were based on plain good intentions. He was mildly criticized from the left by Attlee and Sir Herbert Samuel, supported by Sir Arthur Steele Maitland, Sir Edward Grigg, and others, and then subjected to a long-sustained barrage from Winston Churchill. Churchill had already revealed his opinion of the bill over the BBC when he said, on January 29, 1935, that it was a monstrous monument of sham built by the pygmies. He continued his attack in a similar vein, with the result that almost every government speaker felt the need to caution him that his intemperance was hurting his own cause. From our point of view, his most interesting statement, and one which was not contradicted, said, "I have watched this story from its very unfolding, and what has struck me more than anything else about it has been the amazingly small number of people who have managed to carry matters to their present lamentable pitch. You could almost count them on the fingers of one hand." I have also been struck by the prodigious power which this group of individuals have been able to exert and relate, to use a mechanical term, through the vast machinery of party, of parliament, and of patronage, both here and in the East. It is tragical that they should have been able to mislead the loyalties and use the assets of the empire to its own undoing. I compliment them on their skill, and I compliment them also on their disciples. Their chorus is exceedingly well drilled. This statement was answered by Lord Eustace Percy, who quoted Lord Hugh Cecil's unprofitable mendacity. This led to an argument, in which both sides appealed to the Speaker. Order was restored when Lord Eustace said of Churchill, "I would never impute to him any intention of making a charge which he did not believe himself." It is quite clear that Churchill believed his charge and was referring to what we have called the Milner group, although he would not have known it under that name, nor would he have realized its extreme ramifications. He was merely referring to the extensive influence of that close group of associates which included Hoare, Haley, Curtis, Lothian, Dawson, Amory, Grigg, and Halifax. After 4 days of debate on the second reading, the opposition amendment was rejected by 4-0 for 133 and the bill passed to the committee stage. In the majority were Amory, Buchan, Grigg, Hoare, Ormsby Gort, Simon, Sir Donald Somerville, and Steele, Maitland. The minority consisted of 3 ill-assorted groups: the followers of Churchill, the leaders of the Labour Party, and a fragment of the Cecil bloc with a few others. The Government of India Act of 1935 was the longest bill ever submitted to Parliament, and it underwent the longest debate in history, over 40 days in Commons. In general, the government let the opposition talk itself out and then crushed it on each division. In the third reading, Churchill made his final speech in a tone of painful warning regarding the future of India. He criticized the methods of pressure used by Hoare and said that in 10 years' time the Secretary of State would be haunted by what had been done, and it could be said of him, "God save thee, ancient mariner, from the fiends that plague thee thus. Why lookest thou so? With my crossbow I shot the albatross." These sombre warnings were answered by Leopold Amory, who opened his rejoinder with the words, "Hearing that the last chapter of the book of the prophet Jeremiah." In the House of Lords the bill was taken through its various stages by Lord Zelland, who replaced Hoare as Secretary of State for India in June 1935, and the final speech for the government was from Halifax, recently made Secretary of State for War. The Act received the royal assent on August 1, 1935. The Act never went into effect completely, and by 1939 the Milner Group was considering abandoning it in favour of complete self-government for India. The portions of the Act of 1935 dealing with the central government fell to the ground when the refusal of the princes of the Indian states to accept the Act made a federal solution impossible. The provincial portion began to function in 1937, but with great difficulty because of the extremist agitation from the Congress Party. This party obtained almost half of the seats in the 11 provinces and had a clear majority in 6 provinces. The provincial governments, started in 1937, worked fairly well, and the emergency powers of the central governments, which continued on the 1919 model, were used only twice in over 2 years. When the war began, the Congress Party ordered its ministries to resign. Since the Congress Party members in the legislatures would not support non-Congress ministries, the decree powers of the provincial governors had to be used in those provinces with a Congress majority. In 1945 6 out of the 11 provinces had responsible government. From 1939 on, constitutional progress in India was blocked by a double stalemate. 1. The refusal of the Congress Party to cooperate in government unless the British abandoned India completely, something which could not be done while the Japanese were invading Burma, and 2. The growing refusal of the Muslim League to cooperate with the Congress Party on any basis except partition of India and complete autonomy for the areas with Muslim majorities. The Milner Group, and the British government generally, by 1940 had given up all hope of any successful settlement except complete self-government for India. But it could not give up to untried hands complete control of defense policy during the war. At the same time, the Milner Group generally supported Muslim demands because of its usual emphasis on minority rights. During this period the Milner Group remained predominant in Indian affairs, although the Viceroy Lord Linlithgow was not a member of the group. The Secretary of State for India, however, was Leopold Amery for the whole period 1940 to 1945. A number of efforts were made to reach agreement with the Congress Party, but the completely unrealistic attitude of the party's leaders, especially Gandhi, made this impossible. In 1941, H.V. Hodgson, by that time one of the most important members of the Milner Group, was made Reforms Commissioner for India. The following year the most important effort to break the Indian stalemate was made. This was the Cripps Mission, whose chief advisor was Sir Reginald Coupland, another member of the inner circle of the Milner Group. As a result of the failure of this mission and of the refusal of the Indians to believe in the sincerity of the British, a skepticism that was completely without basis, the situation dragged on until after the war. The election of 1945, which drove the Conservative Party from office, also removed the Milner Group from its positions of influence. The subsequent events, including complete freedom for India and the division of the country into two dominions within the British Commonwealth, were controlled by new hands. But the previous actions of the Milner Group had so committed the situation that these new hands had no possibility nor, indeed, desire to turn the Indian problem into new paths. There can be little doubt that with the Milner Group still in control the events of 1945 to 1948 in respect to India would have differed only in details. The history of British relations with India in the 20th century was disastrous. In this history the Milner Group played a major role. To be sure, the materials with which they had to work were intractable and they had inconvenient obstacles at home like the diehards within the Conservative Party, but these problems were made worse by the misconceptions about India and about human beings held by the Milner Group. The bases on which they built their policy were fine, indeed, to find. These bases were idealistic, almost utopian, to a degree which made it impossible for them to grow and function and made it highly likely that forces of ignorance and barbarism would be released, with results exactly contrary to the desires of the Milner Group. On the basis of law of liberty, human rights, minority guarantees, and self-responsibility, the Milner Group took actions that broke down the lines of external authority in Indian society faster than any lines of internal self-discipline were being created. It is said that the road to perdition is paved with good intentions. The road to the Indian tragedy of 1947 to 1948 was also paved with good intentions, and those paving blocks were manufactured and laid down by the Milner Group. The same good intentions contributed largely to the dissolution of the British Empire, the race wars of South Africa, and the unleashing of the horrors of 1939 to 1945 on the world. To be sure, in India as elsewhere, the Milner Group ran into bad luck for which they were not responsible. The chief case of this in India was the Amritsar massacre of 1919, which was probably the chief reason for Gandhi's refusal to cooperate in carrying out the constitutional reforms of that same year. But the Milner Group's policies were self-inconsistent and were unrealistic. For example, they continually insisted that the parliamentary system was not fitted to Indian conditions, yet they made no real effort to find a more adaptive political system, and every time they gave India the further dose of self-government, it was always another dose of the parliamentary system. But, clinging to their beliefs, they loaded down this system with special devices which hampered it from functioning as a parliamentary system should. The irony of this whole procedure rests in the fact that the minority of agitators in India who wanted self-government wanted it on the parliamentary pattern and regarded every special device and every statement from Britain that it was not adapted to Indian conditions as an indication of the insincerity in the British desire to grant self-government to India. A second error arises from the Milner Group's lack of enthusiasm for democracy. Democracy, as a form of government, involves two parts: one majority rule and two minority rights. Because of the group's lack of faith in democracy, they held no brief for the first of these but devoted all their efforts toward achieving the second. The result was to make the minority uncompromising, at the same time that they diminished the majority's faith in their own sincerity. In India, the result was to make the Muslim League almost completely obstructionist and make the Congress Party almost completely suspicious. The whole policy encouraged extremists and discouraged moderates. This appears at its worst in the systems of communal representation and communal electorates established in India by Britain. The Milner Group knew these were bad, but felt that they were a practical necessity in order to preserve minority rights. In this they were not only wrong, as proved by history, but were sacrificing principle to expediency in a way that can never be permitted by a group whose actions claim to be so largely dictated by principle. To do this weakens the faith of others in the group's principles. The group made another error in their constant tendency to accept the outcry of a small minority of Europeanized agitators as the voice of India. The masses of the Indian people were probably in favor of British rule, for very practical reasons. The British gave these masses good government through the Indian civil service and other services, but they made little effort to reach them on any human, intellectual, or ideological level. The colour line was drawn, not between British and Indians but between British and the masses. For the educated upper-class Indians were treated as equals in the majority of cases. The existence of the colour line did not bother the masses of the people, but when it hit one of the educated minority, he forgot the more numerous group of cases where it had not been applied to him, became anti-British and began to flood the uneducated masses with a deluge of anti-British propaganda. This could have been avoided to a great extent by training the British civil servants to practice racial toleration toward all classes, by increasing the proportion of financial expenditure on elementary education while reducing that on higher education, by using the increased literacy of the masses of the people to impress on them the good they derived from British rule and to remove those grosser superstitions and social customs which justified the colour line to so many English. All of these except the last were in accordance with Milner Group ideas. The members of the group objected to the personal intolerance of the British in India, and regretted the disproportionate share of educational expenditure which went to higher education. See the speech in Parliament of Ormsby Gort, December 11, 1934. But they continued to educate a small minority, most of whom became anti-British agitators, and left the masses of the people exposed to the agitations of that minority. On principle, the group would not interfere with the superstitions and grosser social customs of the masses of the people, on the grounds that to do so would be to interfere with religious freedom. Yet Britain had abolished suttee, child marriage, and thuggery, which were also religious in foundation. If the British could have reduced cow worship, and especially the number of cows, to moderate proportions, they would have conferred on India a blessing greater than the abolition of suttee, child marriage, and thuggery together would have removed the chief source of animosity between Hindu and Muslim, and would have raised the standard of living of the Indian people to a degree that would have more than paid for a system of elementary education. If all of these things had been done, the agitation for independence could have been delayed long enough to build up an electorate capable of working a parliamentary system. Then the parliamentary system, which educated Indians wanted, could have been extended to them without the undemocratic devices and animadversions against it which usually accompanied any effort to introduce it on the part of the British.